So thank you so much, Rod, and everyone for having me and us here today. It's such an honor to have traveled from Cape Town to be here and to meet some of you on the ground. I'm going to be talking today about the work that we've done over the past 10 years as a group in South Africa around changing consensus and some of the things that have worked, some of the things that certainly haven't worked, and what we're doing at the moment, where we're heading, and the lessons we've learned along the way. So obviously, consensus is meant to be a general agreement. And in South Africa, as an example, in 2013, that's what our food pyramid looked like. So that was the general consensus in our country, pretty similar to most places in the world at that time, as to what we should be eating. So this year, this is what our food pyramid looks like. Spot any changes? It hasn't been updated since it was reviewed in 2012, unfortunately. But in the last 14 years, everything's changed, and we all know that. So the question is, what do we need to be doing better as a community globally, as local practitioners and advocates and actual patients, in terms of how to improve the lives of the next generation, and what we've done as a group locally in South Africa that has made differences and some things that haven't. So let's have a little quick look at the general understanding and the criteria of what scientific consensus means. So there's some obvious and accepted elements, which is, of course, the understanding that there needs to be social calibration. So there needs to be peer-reviewed understanding. Experts need to get involved in a big topic like, what should we eat? How should we eat? How should we live? What should we be doing differently? And what the food pyramid should look like. And then, of course, there's the consilience of evidence. So it's actually the process of going through a number of reviews, a number of complex, various tiers of studies from different sources, till eventually there's some kind of understanding of what is right. The rough consensus starts to emerge. And this can take anywhere between 5 and 30 years. So it takes time for the scientific community to debate, negotiate, and find consensus. And that changes in the era that we live in. So at the moment, we're not living in the time of Ansel Keys anymore. Business and commercialization has taken over in a much bigger way than it did happened to play a role in scientific consensus 50 years ago. Of course, we know that, and that connects to the funding of studies. So the third and important element of consensus is that there's a consideration around diversity, and that's a really important one for me. So when I joined the Noakes Foundation 10 years ago, I started to say, okay, well, what are we doing? You know, the Sports Science Institute and Prof Noakes is sort of two of the most established research entities, University of Cape Town, the most respected research academic university in our country. What are we doing? What studies are we doing? And what do the sample groups look like? So the first thing was, I'd come from big business. I worked in pharmaceutical and then in beverages, alcohol beverages, and many other places where we did consumer research. And I thought, God, they've missed a few zeros off these budgets. You know, I mean, what? Like, where's the money? And then I thought, geez, they've missed a few zeros off these sample sizes. You know, I came straight from, I'd done a big campaign that was about the equivalent of a couple of million Australian dollars, just understanding what logo we were going to use on a particular big national beer brand for the Christmas campaign, and into a study where we were looking at what we would eat. And it was so minuscule, the samples were so tiny. So I was outraged as a researcher and as a consumer, and I could not believe that we were only studying white males. And our wonderful researchers said to me, but white males between the ages of 30 and 50 are such a stable sample group that's what we need. They're the easiest people to work with. So understandably, I had some ideas about how that had to change in a country where we had 50-odd% females and about 78% non-white people in our country. It was a bit astronomically confusing how the sampling had been done until that point. So there's some good studies that talk around the definitions of what scientific consensus is and the flaws that come with it. But something that I just want to focus in a little bit on is how we trust scientific consensus. So we have come from generations. My father trusted his doctor over anyone, certainly more than my mother or himself. He did what his doctor told him to do. And it came from a very deep, deep place of trust. So that same trust is probably the trust that you and I applied to our diets throughout our lives. So when I was diagnosed with PCOS when I was 21, quite a long time ago, long before the insulin model was understood, I was told to eat the low GI diet. So I did that for like 15 years, and I was like, okay, well, I can give up sugar, but I can have full fructose in my tea, and I'm doing it all right. So I became vegetarian and then vegan. I ate the low-fat diet. Of course, then comes the outrage that I trusted and believed the good doctor that told me to do that at the time. So trust is a really important thing that we need to start to look at. And that ties into the concept of basic trust, which is a psychological term around how we develop basic trust as a child. It's connected to mothering. So how does this tie into medicine and into consensus? Well, if we start to look at the typical current patient NCD journey. So I want all the doctors in this room, can I just have a show of hands of the physicians in this room and doctors? So there are a lot of you here. So please know that you're not in this slide and in the next few slides, and don't take it personally. I asked AI to give me a picture, an illustration of a good doctor. And there we go. That's the good doctor. And he does look like a good doctor. So this is the typical journey that we go on. It's the journey I went on. I had symptoms for years that I didn't understand, that were non-responsive. So eventually I trusted the good doctor. I paid him good money, and I did what he said I should do for decades. I took the pills, I followed the diet. I got worse. At one point, I got back to the gym, I started exercising more, as most NCD patients do along the journey. I actually, at one point, quit my job and actually became a full-time dancer. I was so committed to fitness. And my obesity and metabolic disease got worse. So at some point, the disease might slow down, it might, slowly continue to progress, depending on how well the good doctor gives you advice and how you follow it. Nothing is addressed in this process around behavioral change. And eventually, I spent much more than a small home would cost on my health journey for the last couple of decades. At some point, you get angry, you get resentful, and you start to go, what the hell am I listening to? And you might see a friend, bump into a friend or a fellow colleague that's lost 30 kilograms. And then one of two things happens. So my granny started smoking when she was pregnant with my mom because she trusted the good doctor who told her it would be good for her pregnancy and her nerves. You might end up there. Or you might be one of the people that sits in this room today that has found a journey towards what we now understand to be low carbohydrate science, therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. You might have made a decision that many of the people that come to nutrition networks tell us about, which is that they were lonely and isolated when they found low carb. So they don't go this route, they go this route. There are a couple of you in this room that have done our certification, and they talk about this. Amanda's here, you'll recognize some of these faces. But the truth is that most of the people that come to us and that come to this community do it because they had lost confidence in their medical training. They felt like they had to rebel, or they were pushed out due to the flaws in the scientific consensus. So somewhere along the line, the scientific community are making mistakes, and they're not serving doctors and physicians and clinicians in the way that they need to actually follow their Hippocratic oath, which is the promise that they made to themselves and to whatever their God is, that they were going to first do no harm. And they're ultimately killing patients along the way. So what does this mean? Is there any wonder that we're in a mental health crisis? We don't actually, as patients, know what to eat. Doctors and physicians don't agree with the guidelines that they're trained on and have to rebel or feel like they're doing something wrong or not practice what they understand to be the correct science. And why does this matter? Why do we need to change it? Well, it's kind of obvious. We have to have the answers. We have to have a rough guideline. We have to find somewhere in this complex global community with so many complex factors, consensus. And then how do we change it? So let's just take a look at good old Prof Noakes, my wonderful colleague and mentor. And he is a perfect example of a person who had to go through a revolution and then be expelled from his community in order to speak the truth. So he said, this is him a couple of years ago, where he said all athletes must be advised to eat a high carbohydrate diet, both in training and especially before the competition. And that's what he did for the 17 Comrades marathons he ran. And for the many decades, he invented the sports goo with Bruce Fordyce. He was an advocate of, and to some extent, the inventor of carbo loading before marathons. So what happened when he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, gained 26 kilos, and then reversed it very quickly when he discovered a low-carbohydrate diet? He did what any good, normal, good doctor would do. There is audio to that, but he tore the pages out of his own book. And he admitted that he was wrong very quickly, very loudly, and very bravely. And what we expected to happen would be that the scientific community would come running and say to him, gosh, you are a person who has changed so many things in your career. You are an A1 rated scientist. We expect, we need to put money behind researching this. We need to work with you. So he carried on. He got, being the popular guy that he is, he got roped into a couple of big, very, very famous best-selling books. And he made a lot of noise because that's what he does, certainly in our country. And unfortunately, what happened was that instead of being listened to at the time, he was, and we all know this trial, he was told that he was a quack. He was told that what he was doing was wrong. And he was ultimately told what, those of you that know Julius Malema, anyone does in this room, maybe not, but he's probably the worst person in South Africa you would ever want to be associated with. He's the most corrupt politician. He's one of just the most unpopular guys around. And he was told that he's the Malema of medicine that was kind of coming to kill people and threaten, the future of life in South Africa, and that he had to be silenced. That was the rhetoric. So he was pushed out of his own university. I was there at the time. I was heading up the Noakes Foundation, and I used to walk into the building, and people would kind of look away. And eventually I said, we've got to get out of this building. Like, we can't be here anymore. And he subsequently retired as an emeritus professor and has never really gone back or been apologized to. So, we all know what he went through over those years, which was the most grueling trial of 4 years, where his integrity, his life, his scientific qualifications were put at huge risk, were attacked. And ultimately what we now understand, which is an emerging field of research within the Noakes Foundation, is what's called academic mobbing. And this is when, co-workers exclude, punish, and ostracize a person to crush or eliminate emerging scientific knowledge that they're bringing into the field. And the whole point of science is that it keeps changing, it keeps updating, and it keeps innovating. So when we start to say, well, where's the randomized control trial that's going to take 5 years? It's like, we don't necessarily have enough time for that. And that's what we said as a foundation. When Tim Noakes was finally cleared, a group of us said, we have got to do something now. We are not going to wait the 20 years for the systems to change. And we're going to do the things that are needed to change the system over time. But between now and then, we're just going to start anyway. And it was really this model, which we all understand. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it was the clarity of science that we understood now. It was like the science was settled. This is the cause, insulin resistance, the driver of most of the non-communicable diseases that we certainly see in our country in South Africa, and diabetes and obesity being our focus at that time. So we said, how are we going to change the way our country eats now? How are we going to take this knowledge down from the high science to people in underserved communities that actually have never heard of this and that are dying because we don't have public health care in South Africa? And we looked at the state of our health in South Africa at the time. And we looked at the causes, which we know now. Non-communicable diseases are the cause of death in developing regions. They've overtaken HIV for some time now. And we looked at some of the policies that our government was putting in place around measures for the prevention and control of non-communicable diseases. And this was the strategic plan that our government in 2013 to 2017 decided it was going to implement. So we had kind of a rough guideline of what public policy was saying, how emerging consensus could change. And there were some good touch points there. So there was physician counselling, fiscal measures, food labelling, worksite interventions. There was a lot to work with. So we as an organisation started to tackle those things because we thought, right, we're going to change consensus and we're going to get the Department of Health to change the food guidelines. That was the main focus. What also came out then was the taxation of sweetened beverages in South Africa. So that was a good step. Sugar tax was put in place a couple of years later. One thing that we learned as a country were the lessons from HIV. So HIV was treated very, very successfully in South Africa by shifting from a medical approach to a public policy approach. So other things started to go. It wasn't just a medication route with HIV. It was very much how we're going to educate people to live different lives, to take their medication, and to work with the disease over the long term. So HIV is no longer known as kind of an actual cause of death in our country, really. It's a very, very controlled disease due to the measures that were put in place. So does anyone know of this health charter or work with it in any way? So only 2 of you in this room actually know that this is still a charter that exists today, and it's a very important one. I'm not going to go into the details of what the charter is about for the interest of time, but basically what it set out to achieve, and it was signed by the World Health Organization, and it had brilliant ideas. It was the vision behind it was that governments were responsible for promoting health instead of disease in their countries. So they should be focusing on preventing disease and supporting and putting money behind health instead of illness. So away from the medication model into the health model. There are very few countries in the world that actually implemented it successfully and had success. They just went back into like, oh, we need our drugs, we need our medication, we need different approaches. So South Africa at the time when I joined the Noakes Foundation was the second most obese country in the world. I think it's now number 3 or 4, so we've dropped a little bit, but that's not because we've got thinner. It's just because everyone else is getting fatter, unfortunately. We had a prayer, and it was very much around how to get this next generation to actually live quality lives in our country, knowing that the average school meal is R2.60 a day, which is like, I can't even think about it. What did I say it was in dollars? I think I did the math, 17 cents a meal. So that was really, to a large extent, what we're seeing with school meals that are just white bread or millipap, which is a kind of white maize, and nothing else with it at times. So what could we do? So we went very quickly from solid science. This was the first week I joined the Noakes Foundation. We were a group of scientists and doctors. A few months later, we became that. So we started doing big community interventions in townships. We started taking huge groups of women that had NCDs, particularly obesity and diabetes and hypertension, through a 6-week Banting or low-carb intervention. The results were astounding. Where's my slide gone? Oh, that's the slide that disappeared. The PowerPoint told us that there was a slide removed. Now we know what it is. That's okay. The results were astounding. And it was a very, very fancy, complex slide, to be fair, so I didn't like it. But basically what we learned through that was very similar to what happened with HIV in our country, was that we needed a public health approach that tied into the principles of the Ottawa Charter in our country. It was the only thing that was going to work. So of course, then as an organization, we went with our data, which in the previous slide that you're now not going to see, was astounding data. It was very, very similar to the Virta Health data. And all we did was a public health intervention over 6 weeks where we dropped in once a week. It cost under $200 per person. The results were absolutely astronomically brilliant. But of course, we were told that it wasn't going to work. And we were knuckle tapped. And our head of Department of Health at the time said, you guys don't understand that we're just trying to get light bulbs to work and get people clean drinking water, and anything we can put into their stomachs, it doesn't matter what. Okay, which was disappointing news for us, so we went back and changed our plan. We carried on anyway, and we're now in a couple of local health clinics. We have some really, really interested funded work that's going on in state clinics in South Africa. This is one of our recent data sets that came out, which is on a group of people with very complex comorbidities. I'm not going to go into this data because I'm watching my stopwatch here, and I'm going to start talking faster if I do. So I'm going to flip through some of these studies quickly, but I did want to just share with you some of the studies. This was a really, really interesting one that we've done over the years, and this was not a published study. We did it within one of our clinics. One of our diabetes physicians headed it up, and all we did was we took a group of about 25 type 2 diabetics, and we gave them all of the breakfast cereals that are recommended by Diabetes SA, for type 2 diabetics. And then we also gave them one new brand of low-carb cereal, which is the bottom line, Heberpup. And we just wanted to look at their blood glucose of the day when they took different cereals. So, of course, what we showed very easily in that quick tactical study to ourselves was that the food system needed to be looked at and analyzed in a much more careful way for the way that diabetics are treated. And what we showed was that there are actually cereals that exist that can bring type 2 diabetics' blood sugar down compared to all of the other lines. So the gray line is Heberpup, which outperforms in terms of glucose impact across all of the cereals except for one outlier, and we're not sure why. So those were very interesting studies. We did another very interesting one in the macadamia industry where we looked at different oils that type 2 and non-type 2 diabetics took in a day and how that affected them. What we found was that macadamia oil brought down in almost all inflammatory markers, and olive oil pushed it up. Coconut oil was relatively neutral, so that was pretty interesting. We also showed that adding of oils and fats to the diet brought down blood glucose. Surprise, surprise, even on those people that, gosh, this really doesn't like my slide format. It's done something very strange with them. Sorry about that. So it lowered inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein in particular, and it brought down satiety, so increased satiety. So people were less hungry when they had oil supplemented into the diet. It was a very, very simple tactical strategy that we put in place where people were given 45 mils of oil a day. That was all they did differently in their diets, and that was people on an LCHF diet and people on a standard diet. And the results were similar across the two groups, but slightly more effective in the ketogenic diet. So why was all this research that we know has been happening around the world not tipping the tide, and what was needed next? So we decided what we had to do next was we had to start training physicians, which was another of those things on the NCD graph that I showed you earlier. And we created in 2018 what's now called the Nutrition Network. Originally, we said we are going to change medicine one practitioner at a time. And we set out to train 33 doctors in South Africa. That was how many we needed to cover our costs of the production of the first training. And we didn't expect it, but we had 260 applicants in the first week from all around the world, very few from South Africa. So that was a bit surprising. But there we were in the first week, like just totally shocked and excited, all of us looking a bit shell-shocked and a lot younger. And our first training was very much for doctors. It used to be called the Professional Training in LCHF and is now called Ketogenic, more to align with our textbook. But it was very much for clinicians. And while all of these clinicians were doing the first training, we were getting these pages and pages of complaints from coaches, nutritionists, personal trainers, advocates, food lobbyists complaining that they weren't allowed to do the training because they didn't have medical certificates. So we expanded and we said, okay, well, we're not going to change medicine one practitioner at a time. We're going to change healthcare one practitioner at a time. And we included something that's become one of the most important pieces of the puzzle in terms of advocacy and changing consensus. And that is what trains what we call advisors, which is not necessarily a coach and it's not necessarily a diabetes educator, but it's a person that can go out into life wherever they are. So we've got people at the UN that have nutrition advisors, and we've got people that work in church groups, and we've got a lot of personal trainers and everything else in between. And advisors tend to go on a journey where they end up working with doctors and or coach, or they become coaches. So as part of that, the research was building. So we offer a very, very comprehensive curated directory of all of the research that's out there. And the science is settled. The science of low carbohydrate is settled. We don't need lists of references. Our textbook's got a couple of thousand references. We had to unfortunately put some of the references online because there were too many in the book to actually be printed because we were so far over our word count. And what we know now is that the work is growing despite the guidelines not necessarily changing. So what is the reason for that? Well, this is just within our group, and this excludes all of the other unbelievable creative myriads of offerings that are out there. So this is a little miniature sample size of what's going on, is all over the world. So this is just a sample of like the kind of medical community that does our trainings at the moment. Demographically, that's how they look. So a lot of doctors and nurses, and then our biggest growing area is the health and wellness and coaching area. And that's what I still think is one of the most important new emerging areas here. So we're now we have 36 online trainings. We have over 8,000 students that have done our trainings, and we're in 107 countries, 10 languages. And the reason I'm telling you this is because all of the people that do our trainings are the people that work with clients, and they all go and buy groceries. And we all have this feeling that we are out of control of how we change the tides in the world, how we tip consensus. And we think that it's over there somewhere in a lofty building with a group of scientists who are actually going to sit around the same table and actually debate this in a decent way. But that's not how the world works. The way the world works sits in your back pocket or in your handbag as a lady. It's the way that you spend your money dictates what happens in the world. So there's no point in blaming all of these big organizations, many of which I've, in my prior career, worked or consulted for, helping them grow their markets. It's very much about how we're going to grow our product. And if no one buys the low-carb bread that's put out there on a mass scale to a country, the factory closes down the next week and a white bread goes in its place. So what does this all have to do with consensus? And how are we going to change the story? So this is just a little snapshot of like the faces. Many of them look familiar to you. How are we going to really concretize this if science is so far behind us? And we've all been doing low carb for up to 10 years or more, and our doctors still can't necessarily. We've found doctors that help us, but if we're in an emergency, we might end up in a hospital where they put a tube of sugar into our stomach for all we know. And I mean, who would want that in this room? So, well, we do it by changing one person at a time. So when I think that we're getting nowhere, I dip into, particularly this group, it's called Banting 7-Day Meal Plans. It's got over 3 million followers. And I just look at examples of people's lives when we think we're getting nowhere. And I look at the scale of the impact of the work that each of us in this room and that each of the incredible people, thank you. Can I have a show of hands of anyone here that's ever done a training with Nutrition Network, just so I know how many of you are around? Okay, a few of you. So I just want to thank everyone that's trusted us with their learning journey so far, and I know a couple of our certs are here as well. And then I look at some of the stories that our actual trained practitioners share with us every day. And when we start to scale out these individual stories, the picture becomes clear that the consensus is changing, that the world is changing, and that the impact is being felt. And it doesn't always feel that way. We kind of feel like we're on a hamster wheel that's going nowhere. But when we start to just take the time to acknowledge the immense work that's being done everywhere by so many in a very, very diverse way, we start to see the impact. This is just a little couple of examples that we pulled from some of our practitioners. So we as a group did this. We filled and plugged. Gosh, this has really messed around my slides. This is so interesting. It took one of our logos and put a macadamia nut there from one of the other slides. That was the Nutrition Network logo where those macadamia nuts are. So what we did is... That's hilarious. What we did is we found a solution to every single one of the things that the government had set out to prevent NCDs in our country. And we offered an easy way, an affordable way, and a massive cost-saving way to them that would allow the change to happen. And of course, the food guideline still looks like this. But after all these years of working so hard, but I did a training around consensus and system change, and I was told that it took 20 years. So we're all waiting it out, and we have to keep going. We have to take things one step at a time. That's the learning from it. But what we have done is we did quite a sweet little exercise at Nutrition Network, and we just scaled up the impacts of our work, just our work. And we said, well, how do we change? We change consensus by changing ourselves and how we spend our money and how we shop. Then we change our community. Then our system is one person, one advocate, one professional, one patient, one meal at a time. We understand how it all fits together. So we're cognizant of the fact that we're all in this together and that all these communities have to talk to each other in better, cleverer ways. And then this is how we change the world. We change consensus with us by changing one person at a time. So we looked at just our universe and we said, well, these are estimates. We have 8,000 practitioners. They're on average 500 patients a month. Each patient whose life has been positively impacted by low carb tends to influence 4. In communities in South Africa, it's 11 people are impacted. And that's over 12 months, over 7 years. So there's the number of lives that we've impacted at Nutrition Network alone in the world. Thank you. Thank you.